All right, let's jump into our deep dive today into the world of Samurai Champloo. We've got all kinds of goodies to sift through, episode summaries, some cool historical tidbits, and even some analysis of the big themes and all that. We're going to break it down all about stylish sword fights, offbeat humor, and a really fascinating look at what life was like way back in Edo period Japan.
You got it. And one of the things you'll find right off the bat with Samurai Champloo is that it's not your typical samurai story. It's not all about those noble warriors and big epic battles. It shows the struggles of just average, everyday people living in that time period, alongside a samurai, of course, even alongside some criminals, actually.
Yeah, totally. It's like, imagine a history lesson, but set to a hip-hop beat. Speaking of history lessons, though, we probably should maybe clarify what we even mean by Edo period, just in case some people listening aren't super familiar with, Japanese history and all that.
Absolutely. So the Edo period, also called the Tokugawa period, lasted for over 250 years, believe it or not, from 1603 to 1868. And it was a pretty unique time in Japan. Relatively peaceful, stable, all thanks to the Tokugawa shogunate, which was basically a kind of military dictatorship.
Okay, so picture this, a really rigid social hierarchy. Samurai, obviously at the very top, and super strict rules. Rules about, well, practically everything. What you could wear, how you were supposed to behave, the whole nine yards. That's the world that Samurai Champloo takes place in. It's really interesting to see how the characters navigate this world.
And how they often push back against those rules, even break them completely. Like right from that very first episode, we're dropped into this world where justice is brutal, sometimes seems more about personal revenge than, what's good for society as a whole. Have you noticed that kind of theme running through the show at all?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Like in episode 1, we see this guy, he's about to be executed, and the crime, attempted bribery, which seems, I don't know, a little harsh maybe. But then, boom, we meet Mugen, this wild, unpredictable swordsman, and his fighting style. Forget kendo. This is more like, I don't know, capoeira almost. He's like the opposite of that classic stoic samurai archetype.
Exactly. And then you got Jin, much more traditional, super skilled samurai, mysterious past. Right away, it's this fascinating contrast between them. And then, of course, we can't forget about Fu, she's the waitress who kicks off this whole story.
Okay, so let's talk about Fu for a second. She's bold, proactive, she knows what she wants. She's the one who hires, well, both Mugen and Jin, right, to help her find this mysterious samurai who smells of sunflowers. I mean, you don't see a female character taking charge like that very often, especially in a story set during this historical period. What do you think about her role, her importance in the story overall?
Oh, she's incredibly important. Fu is constantly, like, challenging what society expects from her, pushing back against, those limited roles that were usually forced on women in Edo period Japan. Her journey, her whole story, it's not just about finding that mysterious samurai. It's also about finding her own place in the world, which is, honestly, just as important.
It's like she's this catalyst for change, not just for herself, but for all the people around her. And speaking of change, episode 2, it just dives right into this whole concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior. But it doesn't romanticize it, which is interesting. A lot of samurai stories do.
I know, right? We see this idea explored through Oniwakamaru. Tragic character. He's ostracized because of how he looks. And his whole story, it exposes the hypocrisy, the hypocrisy that's often hidden beneath these Bushido ideals. It shows how fear, prejudice even, can be used to justify violence. What's your take on that? Like, what does this tell us about what the show's really trying to say?
Well, it definitely makes you rethink those perfect, idealized images of samurai that we often see in movies and stuff. Like, it's asking us, what does it actually mean to be a samurai in a world that's constantly in flux,
And that question, that idea, it keeps coming back in different ways. Like in episode 5, for example, we get a glimpse into the world of art through this historical figure, Hiwa Morinobu. He was this pioneer of ukiyo-e woodblock prints. Basically, these were prints. They depicted everyday life, like scenes from the pleasure districts, landscapes, that sort of thing. A fascinating contrast to those, the typical samurai stories.
Oh, and it's Who, isn't it? Who's the one who really appreciates Hiwa's art, especially those sunflowers. And her appreciation inspires him, encourages him to, like, break free from convention and to try to gain recognition in Europe. It's pretty amazing how the show can connect these things, Art, history, and individual journey, all woven together. Have you noticed that happening in other episodes, too?
Yeah, for sure. That's one of the things that makes Samurai Champloo so unique. It's almost like a tapestry or something. All these different threads, history and art and music, even social commentary, all woven together.
It keeps things interesting, that's for sure. You never know what's coming next. And speaking of keeping things interesting, episode 8, we meet this guy, Nagamitsu. He's like this wannabe samurai, total delusions of grandeur. Pretty hilarious, but I feel like there's something deeper going on there too, right? Like he's not just comic relief.
Oh yeah, totally. Nagamitsu, he's like the embodiment of what happens when you cling to like outdated ideals, when the world around you is changing and you just refuse to change with it. He's almost like a satire of that whole romanticized samurai image. All style, no substance. What do you think about her? As a character, I mean.
Well, I think he shows how the show can use humor to like sneak in some pretty serious themes, kind of like a spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down. And speaking of serious themes, episode 9, it tackles this whole clash between tradition and progress head on with those warrior priests. You know, the ones disguised as Tengu, those mythical creatures with the long noses and
Oh
wings.
yeah, those Tengu masks. Super creepy, but visually striking, too. And they represent this generational divide, right? You've got the older generation stuck in that things were tougher in my day mindset. And they're the ones advocating for this violent revolution.
It's a conflict that feels, I don't know, strangely relevant even today, right? Societies are always changing, evolving, and whenever that happens, there's bound to be pushback, especially from the people who benefit from, the way things already are. It makes you think about how we deal with change in our own lives, doesn't it?
It really does. And that whole theme of societal change, well, it keeps going. Like in episode 11 with Osuzu's story. She's trapped in this brothel, forced to, basically sacrifice her dreams just to pay off her father's debts. It's a pretty stark reminder of, well, how limited the options were for women back then.
Yeah, it's tough to see her struggle like that, but it's also inspiring how she keeps her spirit up. And she and Fu, they form this really strong bond. And Sue, she encourages Osuzu to defy those societal constraints. What do you think the show's trying to say about women's roles in this society?
I think it's highlighting how important it is to challenge those norms, even in a society that feels so strict and rigid. Osuzu and Fu, they represent this kind of quiet rebellion against the expectations that are being forced upon them. And their friendship, I think that's a really powerful symbol of female solidarity, of resilience, too.
It's definitely one of the most moving parts of the show, for sure. And speaking of defying expectations, episode 16, we meet a real historical figure, Isaac Titsing. He was the head of the Dutch East India Company's trading post in Japan. Don't see that every day, a historical figure just popping up in an anime like that.
It's a really smart move, honestly. It doesn't just present him as some name in a history book. He's a complex person with his own experiences, relationships. All his interactions with Mugen, Jin, and the Fu, they really humanize him, challenge those preconceived ideas we often have about historical figures.
Yeah, and it really highlights how important it is to see history from multiple perspectives. It's not just about, like, memorizing dates and battles. It's about the stories of the people who lived through those times.
Exactly. And speaking of stories that are often overlooked, episode 19 tackles the persecution of Christians in Edo period Japan. It's a dark, dark chapter in history. And the show, well, it doesn't shy away from showing how brutal it really was.
Yeah, like we see this corrupt priest, Xavier. He's taking advantage of the Christians' vulnerability, using it for his own personal gain. It's a reminder of how easily power can be abused. But then, right in the middle of all this darkness, you've got Mugen, of all people, showing sympathy for the Christians.
I know, I was surprised too. But it's not that he's suddenly religious. It's his whole anti-authoritarian nature, right? He sees them as fellow outcasts, victims of this system that wants to control everything and everyone. I think it reminds us that empathy can come from, well, anywhere, sometimes the most unexpected places.
And that sense of being an outsider, that shared experience, it creates a sort of solidarity between them, even though they come from completely different backgrounds. Now, episode 21, we're introduced to Sarah. She's blind, but incredibly skilled warrior. And she's fighting to protect her son, even though he's, already dead. What did you think of her character?
Sarah's story, man, it's tragic, but also really empowering. She embodies that strength and resilience that you see in a lot of women, I guess, especially when they're facing unimaginable loss or when someone's trying to manipulate them. Or her fighting style, so unique, so much emphasis on agility and awareness. Beautiful, but also deadly.
It's definitely different from the brute force styles that we see from, Mugen and Jin. Makes you appreciate how much variety the show has when it comes to combat. Now, episode 22, things get a little weird, right?
Yeah, definitely one of the most surreal episodes in the whole series. Open to interpretation, but I kind of see it as a commentary on holding on to outdated ideals, like the danger of being stuck in the past, refusing to let go.
Almost like the show's throwing us a curveball, challenging our expectations of what a samurai story can even be. And speaking of curveballs, episode 23, baseball in Edo period Japan. Didn't see that coming.
That one was fun. This sport that's, so American suddenly becomes this tool for diplomacy and a way to address anxieties about Japan's isolationist policies at the time. Pretty clever way to explore cross-cultural exchange, I think, and challenge the idea that, history is always pure, always stays in its lane.
Yeah, all the humor and anachronisms, I think they highlight how silly it is to try and impose, like, modern values on the past. But it also suggests that even cultures that seem totally different, they can still find common ground. What are your thoughts on that? Like, the blending of historical and modern elements, the whole thing.
I think it's honestly one of the show's greatest strengths. It creates this viewing experience that's so unique, entertaining, but also makes you think. And it reminds us that history, it's not just a bunch of boring facts, It's something alive, something we can interpret, reimagine, in tons of different ways.
It's like the show's saying, hey, engage with history however you want. Find the connections, the meanings that speak to you. And speaking of personal connections, the story takes a pretty dramatic turn in the climactic three-part episode. Starting with episode 24, we find out that the shogunate, they've been pulling the strings the whole time, manipulating the trio's journey to track down Fu's father, Seo Kasumi, because they see him as, a threat to their power. What was your reaction when that was revealed?
I thought it was a brilliant twist. Raises the stakes, brings all those episodic adventures together in a way that just feels right. Plus, we get introduced to Kariya Kagetoki. Seems like these, I don't know, harmless gardener at first, but turns out he's this master swordsman, probably the most dangerous opponent our heroes have faced yet.
And his backstory, man, it's heartbreaking. Born into a samurai family, but the world has moved on, and he feels like a relic of a bygone era. I don't know about you, but his lament about being born in the wrong time really hit me hard. Have you ever felt that way, like you were just born in the wrong century?
Oh, definitely. I think that's something a lot of people can relate to, especially when society is changing so fast. Korea, he represents that dying breed of samurai, struggling to find, a reason to exist in a world that doesn't need them anymore. And his conflict with Jin, who is also wrestling with his samurai identity in this changing world, it's philosophical, but it's also really sad. What did you think about their final duel?
So tense, so emotional. It wasn't just a fight, it was this clash of ideologies, right? Holding on to the past versus adapting to the present. And the way it ends, with Jin choosing to die, protecting Fu, but on his own terms. Tragic, but also kind of freeing, like he finally found something worth fighting for, something more than just survival. And then there's Mugen. He's facing his own reckoning in these last few episodes.
Yeah, that fight with Umano's the one-eyed swordsman consumed by revenge. Brutal, chaotic, just like the stuff going on inside Mugen's head. He's haunted by the pain he's caused, realizing that his quest for freedom, well, it came with a price. What are your thoughts on Mugen's journey, his development as a character?
It's like a reminder that even people who seem to value freedom above everything else, they can still be changed by the people they meet, the connections they make. Mugen's relationship with Jin and Fu, even though he'd probably never admit it, it's changed him. He starts to see the value in those bonds, even if he knows they won't last forever.
It's subtle, but yeah, he definitely goes through a transformation. And then you've got Fu, who finally reaches her destination, only to find that her father, well, he's not who she thought he was. That confrontation with Seo Kasumi, so heartbreaking. He regrets leaving his family, but it's too late for apologies. Really explores how complicated family relationships can be, how much impact the choices we make can have, even years later.
And Fu, she has to deal with that, with the truth about her father. He's not the man she imagined. But even though she's disillusioned, she's still incredibly strong. She confronts her pain, her anger, her disappointment. She doesn't try to bury it.
And in the end, she chooses to move on, accepts the truth about her father, lets go of that desire for revenge. She embraces the future, even though she doesn't know what it holds.
It's a powerful message, isn't it, about resilience, acceptance, and it speaks to that big theme that runs through the whole show, finding your own way even when the world feels like it has no place for you.
Absolutely. It's all about embracing change, letting go of the past, creating your own destiny. And sometimes that journey, well, it's going to be messy, chaotic, full of contradictions, just like Samurai Champloo itself.
But it's in those contradictions, in those unexpected moments of beauty and brutality that, well, that's where we find something truly special, something unforgettable, and something that still resonates with people today.
Totally agree. Those themes of social change, individual agency, the whole search for meaning in a world that often seems pretty meaningless, they're just as relevant now as they were back then in Edo period Japan, I mean.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about how Samurai Champloo flips those typical samurai tropes on their head. It's focused on just, normal people and those big themes, change, identity, finding your place. But before we move on, I wanted to touch on something that I find really interesting, the name Samurai Champloo. What's up with that?
Oh yeah, Champloo or champuru comes from the Okinawan dialect. And it refers to this dish, this mix of all kinds of different ingredients.
Like a cultural stir fry. And it's such a perfect metaphor for the show itself, don't you think? You've got historical realism mixed with totally anachronistic stuff, hip hop music, modern slang. It's this totally unique creation. What do you think they were going for with that? The creators, I mean.
I think they wanted to shake things up, challenge what we expect from a period piece. Like they're saying, hey, history doesn't have to be boring. It can be exciting, energetic, even a little bit rebellious.
It definitely brings a lot of energy and playfulness to the story, and it makes that whole historical setting feel, I don't know, more relatable somehow.
For sure. It's like they took those historical figures and events and infused them with this modern sensibility, makes them resonate with today's viewers. It's a reminder that even though this all happened centuries ago, those core human experiences, love, loss, ambition, betrayal, they're timeless, universal.
Like we're looking at history through this new lens, filtered through hip hop and modern aesthetics. And speaking of culture, one of my favorite things about Samurai Champloo is how it explores, Japanese culture. Beyond just the samurai, I mean.
Yeah, definitely. We get these glimpses into the lives of regular people, merchants, artisans, farmers, even the outcasts who are living on the fringes of society. We see what they struggled with, what brought them joy, their beliefs, their traditions.
It's like a window into a world that, you don't usually see in those additional history books. Makes the Edo period feel so much more real, more human, wouldn't you say?
Completely. It's not just about big events and battles. It's about those small, everyday moments that make up a life, and those moments that's how we really connect with these characters, with this time period. On a deeper level, I mean.
And that brings us back to the big question, the one we always ask. What does all of this mean for you, the listener? I mean, why should you care about a show set in feudal Japan with samurai and hip-hop and, well, a lot of philosophical stuff?
Well, I think Samurai Champloo gives us this really unique perspective on history, on culture, even on the human experience as a whole. It challenges us to question what we think we know, to embrace change, and to find meaning in a world that can often feel pretty chaotic. And it does all of this with a gripping story, characters you really care about, and a visual and musical style that's, well, there's nothing else like it.
It's a show that stays with you. It makes you think. And in the end, you come away feeling, I don't know, maybe a little more connected to the world around you. I think it's time to wrap things up, though.
Yeah, agreed. But before we go, one last thought. Throughout the whole show, the characters are constantly wrestling with this idea of finding their purpose. In a world that's always changing, I mean, they're searching for something to believe in, something to fight for, something that makes their lives feel meaningful. And honestly, I think that's something that all of us can relate to, no matter when or where we live. So as you go about your day, think about this. What is it that makes your life feel meaningful? What are you searching for? And how can you forge your own path in a world that's constantly changing?
Wow, those are some big questions to ponder. And I think Samurai Champloo, with all its complexities, all its contradictions, it gives us a way to explore them, not through easy answers, but through these amazing stories, characters that feel real, and a unique blend of history, art, and social commentary. Yeah, it's like it holds up this mirror and we see ourselves in it, makes us think about what we believe, and maybe even embrace the unknown, even when things get messy.
And that's really where Samurai Champloo shines, you know what I mean? It doesn't try to force-feed you these easy answers or preachy morals. It lays it all out, the complexity, the characters, and lets you, the viewer, come to your own conclusions.
Totally agree. It sticks with you, this show. Gets you thinking. And speaking of things that stick with you, I wanted to go back to something we touched on early. The way it mixes historical realism with these like out-of-place Elenies. You've got samurai with their katanas, but then you've also got hip-hop beats, breakdancing. It's a wild combination. What's your take on that stylistic choice?
I think it's brilliant. Honestly, it throws you off guard. You think you know what to expect from a period piece, and then boom. It's like the creators are saying, hey, who says history has to be boring? It could be fun, energetic, even a little rebellious.
Yeah, it definitely injects this energy, this playfulness into the story. Makes the historical setting feel, I don't know, more approachable somehow.
For sure. It's like they took these historical figures, historical events, and they gave them this modern twist, this modern sensibility. Helps them connect with people watching today. I think it reminds us that even though this happened a long time ago, the basic human stuff, you know, love, loss, ambition, betrayal, that's all timeless. It's universal.
Like we're seeing history through a brand new lens, one that's, influenced by hip hop and modern aesthetics. And speaking of culture, I love how Samurai Champloo shows us all these different facets of Japanese culture, not just the samurai stuff.
Oh yeah, definitely. It shows the lives of everyday people, the merchants, the artisans, the farmers, even the outcasts, the people living on the fringes of society. We see what their lives were like, their struggles, their joys, their traditions, everything.
Yeah, it's like a glimpse into this whole world that usually gets left out of the history books. It makes the Edo period feel so much more real, so much more human. Don't you think?
Totally. It's not just about those big stories and battles. It's about the everyday moments that make up a life. And through those moments, that's how we connect with these characters, with this time period, on a much deeper level.
And it all comes back to that question we always ask, what does all this mean for you? The listener, I mean, why should you even care about a show about feudal Japan with samurai and hip-hop and, let's face it, some pretty deep thoughts?
Well, I think Samurai Champloo gives us this really unique way of looking at things, at history, at different cultures, even at the human experience itself. It encourages us to question everything, to be open to change, and to try to find meaning in a world that often feels pretty chaotic. And it does all this through this amazing story, characters you actually care about, and a visual and musical style that's just, well, it's one of a kind.
Yeah, it's a show that stays with you, makes you think, and when it's over, you might even feel, I don't know, maybe a little more connected to the world around you. But we've been talking for a while now, so I think it's about time to wrap things up.
Yeah, good idea. But before we go, I want to leave you with one last thing to think about. Throughout the show, you see these characters struggling with this idea of finding their purpose. You know, in a world that's constantly changing, they're looking for something to believe in, something to fight for, something that gives their lives meaning. And honestly, I think that's something we all struggle with, no matter who we are or where we come from. So as you go about your day, ask yourself, what is it that is your life meaning? What are you searching for? And how can you create your own path, even in a world that's constantly changing around you?
Those are some pretty powerful questions, and I think Samurai Champloo, even with all its twists and turns, gives us a way to start exploring them.
Totally. It's a journey worth taking, even if you're not sure where you'll end up.
And on that note, we'll let you continue on your own journey. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Samurai Champloo.